Good evening, everyone. We'll give everyone 30 seconds or so to get connected here before we jump into our open house this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. All right, we've hit a bit of a critical mass here, and I'm seeing the waiting room slow down just a little bit. So why don't we jump in with some welcomes and introductions as maybe a few more folks join us this evening. Um, Good evening, everyone. My name is Matt Rodriguez, and I'm a planner here at WSP, the consulting team working with the township on the Urban Design Guidelines project, and we'll certainly do some proper introductions coming up. We're really glad you're able to join us this evening for the first of two public open houses that we're hosting to introduce the Draft Village Urban Design Guidelines. And so these design guidelines have been posted on the speaking webpage and for some time now in advance of the open house. So this is really a great opportunity to seek your input and feedback, but we'll also be providing a walkthrough of the document, providing a bit of an explainer of how we got to where we are and some of the next steps in the process. We'll start with a few introductions. My colleague Bobby Gauthier from WSP will walk through a presentation, and then we'll certainly save a good amount of time at the end of today's session for Q&A and discussion. And so we certainly want to hear from you and respond to your questions and comments on the draft guidelines. We'll then wrap up and go over some next steps in the process. Just to kick things off, sort of a refresher for everyone, and I certainly recognize some familiar names and familiar faces, but this project got started in 2021. And we had some consultation as part of our first round of consultation, which we'll explain a bit later. And we're really excited to be here today to be presenting the draft guidelines. This is an important milestone for the township and the project team. From here, we'll be looking to finalize them and really start using these as a tool to shape development across the villages. Today, we're here to seek your input and comments, and certainly would welcome that as well following the session and should anything arise. So in terms of participation in today's public open house, we do encourage you to raise your hand if you wish to speak during the Q&A session. And there's a number of ways you can do that. If you're joining via a computer, you can use the raise hand icon, or on Windows, you can click Alt-Y. On Mac, that's Option-Y. If you're joining us over the telephone, you can press *9 to raise your hand and then *6 to mute or unmute and mute yourself. We'd also welcome you to use the chat box during today's session to post your question. We'll be getting to all the questions at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. And so if we're going through the presentation and something comes up that is a question or a comment that you might have, we'd encourage you to put those in the chat box and we'll respond to those in the order that they come in once we get to the Q&A portion of this evening. Just also a reminder that this session is being recorded and also posted to the speaking page. So for those who are joining us, if there's something you missed or wanted to rewatch, the good news is that there will be a video within the next few days posted on the township's website. And certainly if there's some folks who have missed it or you want to share it with your friends and family, certainly welcome to share it at that time as well. And we do ask that you remain muted until the Q&A, until you're called upon, just to avoid any unnecessary background noise. So with that, we'll do a few introductions, and I'll pass it first to Aloma just to introduce the township team.
Thanks, Matt. My name is Aloma Dreyer. I'm the Senior Policy Planner with the Township. Also here from staff tonight is Kristen Harrison, Manager of Policy Planning, as well as our Director, Stephen Naylor, the Director of Growth Management Services. We also have several other development planning staff in attendance, Colin Pang and Paul Kulik, and Councillor Eek is in attendance as well.
Fantastic. Great to have you all joining us. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day. And I will now pass it over to my colleague Bobby Gauthier to introduce himself and to sort of kick off the presentation. So Bobby, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Matt. So as Matt mentioned, my name is Bobby Gauthier. I'm a project manager with WSP. So I'll be walking through the presentation today. Matt's introduced himself, and I see our colleague, John Taziopoulos, has also joined us. So just wanted to make a mention of that. So good evening, John.
Good evening.
And I think we can move on to the next slide and I'll dive into things.
Sorry, just before we move on from the introductions, I just wanted to know, I think I also saw Councillor Schaefer on the call. So thank you, Councillor Schaefer, for joining us as well.
Okay, thanks for noting that. Okay, so the presentation tonight, it's about 30 to 40 minutes long, and then we'll save most of the time tonight for Q&A and comments. I can certainly appreciate that we've only recently posted the draft urban design guidelines. So if you haven't had a chance to review the document yet, we'll certainly be happy to accept comments subsequently to this meeting. So for some people, I think this might be viewed as more of an orientation to the document. So I'm approaching the presentation sort of with that in mind. So what is urban design and what are the urban design guidelines? So urban design, I view as being certainly a discipline, kind of somewhere between urban planning and architecture, that's engaged in shaping the built environment. So urban design is about addressing how people interact with buildings, address how people interact with the public realm, and how the built environment looks and how it functions. And to that, urban design guidelines are basically statements. They're statements that express what the township wishes to see in the built environment. How does the community look, and also how does it function? Like I said, how do people interact with the environment? And the urban design guidelines that we'll be talking about today address a very broad range of different matters. They address matters like built form and architectural treatment. Built form, I think, is worth defining. Built form, at least in my mind, is a broad expression that refers to the massing and the height of buildings, but also where buildings are located on a property. And architectural treatment refers to more about the details of how facades look and how facades are articulated. Urban design guidelines also address mobility, and we'll talk about that today, is that you can have guidelines that speak to bringing buildings close to the streetscape so that people can better access entrances and promote walkability. Urban design guidelines, of course, address public realm as a critical component of them. So you can have guidelines that speak to the look of streetscapes and the treatment of things like street furniture, landscaping, and other elements of public space. And urban design guidelines also typically will address heritage. So how do we ensure that unique, desirable elements of community design are being properly understood and reflected in the design of new development? And further to that, how can heritage buildings be maintained and enhanced when they're interfaced with new development? So urban design guidelines are very broad in their scope. Let's move to the next slide. So a little bit about the project and some of the overarching objectives of what these urban design guidelines are intended to achieve. So of course, the main intent of this project is to review and to update the township's existing urban design guidelines, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. But it's about reviewing and updating them into a new consolidated and more comprehensive set of urban design guidelines for the villages. A key aspect of this project is implementing the new official plan amongst many other projects and initiatives to ensure that development is going to meet the township's expectations for urban design. And of course, the urban design guidelines that exist now are a basis for the new urban design guidelines that we've drafted. The project also, if you've been participating thus far, there's been a previous deliverable, which is a discussion paper that was produced in 2021. So that served as a basis for outlining and structuring the design guidelines that we're presenting today. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the existing urban design guidelines that the township's been administering for well over a decade now. So there are urban design guidelines applicable to what was referred to as the village centers for each of the 3 villages, and those date back to 2006. There's also some urban design guidelines for the township's employment areas. So, I mean, firstly, you can see that these guidelines are a bit outdated, right? They predate the township's new official plan. They predate a lot of planning work that the township's been doing for the past 10 years. So on one hand, there's a need to update the guidelines for alignment with the township's various planning documents. But the other thing I'll say too is that the guidelines are not that comprehensive. They focus much more on the historic central cores of the villages, whereas the township has a desire to administer guidelines that are much more comprehensive for the different villages. For example, as it says on the slide, the guidelines do not address the township's mature, stable, and established neighborhoods. So that's a key gap that we're looking to fill as part of this project. Next slide, please. So the slide here illustrates the overall work plan for the design guidelines. So you can see it's essentially a 3-phase work program. The first phase involved a background review resulting in that discussion paper that I talked about earlier. That was presented at a series of open houses last year. And then we're in phase 2 right now, where the design guidelines have been produced in draft, and now we're presenting them at a public open house to start to seek some input on them. And I think the intent after today is we'll move into phase 3, which is finalizing the urban design guidelines. That'll involve collecting input from people, written input, and the verbal comments that we received this evening. And then we'll be presenting that to council for consideration. We've got a tentative council update for November 7th. And then after that, we'll be looking to finalize all the documents and seek council adoption. Council adoption is not likely going to occur until early next year. So there is a fair bit of time for people to still provide comments into this process. So as I said, we're here tonight to present just the first draft of the design guidelines, and then we wouldn't be looking for council adoption for at least a few months from now. So there is some time to make some revisions. Next slide, Matt. So I mentioned that a few public open houses were held to have some focused discussions around some of the design challenges in each of the villages. And this slide characterizes, I think, some of the key comments we've heard. Certainly, I think there's probably been some more detail in some of the comments, but I think this is a good summary of some of the key points. So I'll walk through this very quickly. So in Schaumburg, we heard, there's a need to maintain a safe and friendly community and maintain that small scale that makes Schaumburg such a unique place to live. There's been some comments about making Schaumburg more walkable. So would it be desirable to have improved public realm amenities to make the community easier to walk in and more pleasant to walk in? And then also a key comment is about ensuring that new buildings and development is aesthetically compatible and mixes well with the historic context of Schaumburg. I think that's a very critical point because compatibility shouldn't just be about land use compatibility, but also, I like that phrase, aesthetically compatible. There's a need for buildings to enhance and support an overall aesthetic theme in the community. And so how can the guidelines support that? So in Nobleton, we heard just a few examples of some of the key comments. Improve and beautify the core area. Certainly there's a bit of a challenge in Nobleton with the busy regional roads. So how can the guidelines help to soften the impact of the regional roads and again, help to promote walkability? And of course, in Nobleton, people have certainly observed instances of replacement homes where older homes are being purchased, demolished, and rebuilt with newer, larger homes. So there's a need to have some guidance to ensure that replacement homes are more sensitively integrated into the neighborhoods. Another key comment is about improving the public realm, supporting facade improvements and enhanced amenities, again, to make the community more walkable and comfortable. In King City, I think we heard a number of similar comments. So preserving heritage and character is important in King City. There are certainly a concentration of historic buildings and an established historic building line in King City that needs to be needs to be reflected moving forward in the face of development. Just like in Nobleton, King City's been experiencing replacement homes and infill homes, and there's a need to have some guidance to ensure that it's sensitively integrated. Similarly, improving the public realm, King City also has busy regional roads. So are there ways of softening the impacts and improving the walkability? And also promoting active transportation, so ensuring that buildings are closer to the sidewalk and that walkability is prioritized as an objective in community design. So that's just basically a summary of some of the key comments that we heard at those open houses. And we hope we've addressed those comments in our draft urban design guidelines. Next slide, please. So the study area for our urban design guidelines, as I said, focuses on the 3 villages. And I'll get into the details of what parts of the 3 villages on the next few slides. But I think it's important to point out that the guidelines are not intended to be applied to the rural areas or the hamlet areas of the township, but they are focused on the 3 delineated villages as described in the official plan. Next slide. So if you've had a chance to look at the draft urban design guidelines, you may have seen that it's structured according to 3 key areas. So there's a chapter of guidelines on what we call the village centers. There's a chapter on the established neighborhoods, and there's a chapter on the employment areas. The village centers, we use that phrase to collectively refer to a few different land use designations in the official plan. So the village centers, when I say that, I'm referring to the village cores, which are the historic centers of each of the 3 villages. Nobleton, Schaumburg, and King City all have a village core. There are some mixed use areas, so some specific areas that are kind of considered to be like transitional areas between the cores and the outer edges of the communities. And the village centers also include what we call the transit station area. The transit station area is a specific area near the King City GO station. So that's an area that's specific to King City. So those are the 3 areas. And like I said, if you've seen the urban design guidelines, they have guidelines that are applicable to each of those 3 areas. That's the way the guidelines are organized. Next slide, please. So having just a quick look at Nobleton, and I can appreciate it, it might be hard to see the specific colors and such, but this is the land use schedule that comes out of the township's official plan. And it's really what gives us the guidance for establishing those 3 key areas in the urban design guidelines. So you can see the village core is the orange that's centered around Highway 27 and King Road. There's extensive established neighborhoods that you see in the vibrant yellow color. And even just looking at the land use map, you can see there's a lot of variety amongst the established neighborhoods, lots of different characteristics of streetscapes and lot patterns. And then the mixed use areas you can see are those light purple areas. There's a few such areas in Nobleton, one of them on the south side of King Road, just east of the core, and then a couple of areas on sort of the north end of the village on Highway 27. And there's one designated employment area, and that's right at the south end of the community. And the employment area is designated by the official plan as helping to accommodate the majority of employment growth amongst the various employment areas in the villages. So there's some specifically permitted uses. Residential uses are not permitted in the employment areas. It's mainly intended for, for offices and light industrial and so on. Next slide. So having a look at Schaumburg. So the Schaumburg also has a village core, of course, centered around Main Street. There's established neighborhoods across the community as well, kind of building out from the village core. There's a few mixed use area sites, mainly sort of on the east edge of the community, or rather west of Highway 27. And then there's a very expansive employment area in Schaumburg, some of which is built out, some of which still has opportunity for development, and that's largely on the east side of the community. That's just the light blue, not the darker blue. Next slide. And then looking at King City. So again, the village core is in the center of the community around King Road and Keele Street. You can see that in the orange. The transit station area is just south of the village core on Keele Street, and it's just around the King City GO station where there is some opportunity for intensification. And just like in the other communities, there's varied established neighborhoods with all kinds of different characteristics spread across the community. The mixed use areas, it's a little bit hard to see them on this map, but there's a few little pockets of mixed use areas along King Road principally. So on the north side of King Road and then west of Dufferin Street as well. And then of course, there's a significant employment area just on the west side of the community in the light blue. Okay, next slide. Okay, so thus far in the presentation, I've been talking about context, and I'm going to move into giving a bit of orientation to the content of the draft Village Urban Design Guidelines. And one of the prefacing sections of the document focuses on what we call the guiding principles. And I do think it's worth spending a few minutes describing what the guiding principles are. So the guiding principles are really the key objectives for what the guidelines are trying to achieve. And they kind of represent visionary statements. And effectively, all of the guidelines in the document work to achieve one or more of these guiding principles. So the first guiding principle speaks to maintaining and enhancing each village's historic small town character, right? So there's a need to recognize that every village and every neighborhood is different, and design needs to be contextually sensitive to that. The second guiding principle is about promoting complete communities and connected animated pedestrian network. So a very important principle of the guidelines is getting people out of their cars and getting people to walk around. And how can you facilitate that through urban design? By bringing buildings up to the street and creating new pedestrian connections. Achieving excellence in architecture, design, and sustainability is a very key principle. And the official plan speaks a lot to that. The township has high expectations for development. You know, when someone builds a new building, it's likely going to be maintained for many years, maybe even centuries. So achieving excellence in architecture and design and sustainability is about thinking about the long term and about having high expectations for what development looks like. Maintaining and enhancing the individual character of established neighborhoods. It's worth drawing that out as a key objective of the official plan, is that the established neighborhoods are not all the same. They all have different characteristics. They have different lot patterns, different sort of amounts of open space. And when development in the form of replacement homes comes into play, how can that individual character be recognized and sensitively integrated into the design of new houses? Ensuring development sensitively interfaces with existing built forms. So if development is going to be near an established neighborhood, how do you promote transition and how do you promote compatibility between some higher density uses and adjacent lower density uses? That's another key principle. Next slide. Principle 6 is about connecting and developing the township's recreational network. So as development moves forward, opportunities to bring about walkability and get people out on the street and improve the public realm. And even if there's opportunities to expand the trail network through development, that should absolutely be explored. Enhancing the natural heritage system. So the township maintains a lot of documents that already protect the natural heritage system, but from a design point of view, you know, are there ways of helping to appreciate the natural heritage system, either by maintaining views and vistas to important features? Welcoming visitors and residents with attractive gateways and focal points. So the guidelines speak a fair bit to this notion of, you know, sites that are particularly visible, either because they're at the gateway of a village, like they're at the edge of a village and people will tend to see it, or because, for example, they're at the corner of a couple of intersecting streets. In any case, the guidelines very much promote a higher degree of architectural treatment and even other features like enhanced landscaping or specific gateway features that help to add prominence and speak to what the township is all about. Promoting holistic approach to site and building sustainability. Sustainability is a very important objective of the official plan. So how can developers promote sustainability. And the UDGs very much speak to ensuring that sustainability is very thoughtfully woven into the design of development, and innovative approaches to sustainability. Things like green roofs and renewable energy, those things should be considered as part of development review. And finally, supporting active transportation and multimodal travel with built forms. So I think I've kind of touched on this already, but design plays a big role in whether people drive or whether they walk. Bringing buildings up to the street is important. Directing parking areas to the rear of sites and that sort of thing can help to support active transportation within the existing context. Okay, next slide. So that's a view of some of the key principles and I think overarching objectives of the guidelines. A few words on the project drivers. So the urban design guidelines I view very much as being an implementation tool, and also being complementary to other studies, plans, and policies that the township administers. The township actually has a very, very wide tool set when it comes to reviewing development applications. And the UDGs are just one other tool to kind of round out all of the different things the township has already. So obviously there's the official plan. The township undertakes streetscaping plans. There's been some revitalization plan, community improvement plan. There's green development standards and engineering standards and so on. And again, the UDGs are about just rounding out that tool set and ensuring that all the bases are covered from a development review point of view. Next slide. So speaking a little bit about the official plan, I keep mentioning the official plan and I haven't really described it yet, although I suspect a lot of people on the call have at least some sense of what it looks like. So the official plan is one of the township's very key planning documents, and it sets out the township's policy for managing growth, managing intensification, managing land use change, height and density, and so on. So in many ways, the UDGs are intended to complement and implement the policies of the official plan. And the official plan is a fairly new document. It was adopted by council in September 2019. And I think it's probably the main reason why these guidelines are being updated now is to support these policies. So the official plan intends, if you're not aware of it, it intends for growth to be accommodated, at least in part through intensification. So some growth in the township in the form of new units needs to be directed to the built up areas of the community. And the official plan gives a framework for where that should occur and what that should look like. In particular, intensification is directed to the village core, the transit station area, and the mixed use designations. So the urban design guidelines will play a role in helping to shape what that intensification looks like over time. There's a need to maintain the character of existing neighborhoods. That's a very important principle of the official plan. It speaks to established neighborhoods in the community, and it recognizes that established neighborhoods have been experiencing pressure in terms of replacement dwellings. And so the urban design guidelines, I think, are a very key tool for helping to allow for that to occur, but in a more sensitive way. And then there are some policies to protect the employment areas. And the urban design guidelines play a role in helping to shape what the employment areas are going to look like, because they are quite prominent in each of the three villages, I think. All the employment areas are located at kind of the gateways of each of the three villages, so they should be treated with a high expectation of design. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll spend just a few minutes and give some summary as to what the urban design guidelines say. So I've got a few slides on the village centers, a few slides on the established neighborhoods, and a couple of slides on the employment areas. So if you've seen the guidelines, you'll know it's a very detailed, very lengthy document. So it's a little bit hard to summarize everything it says. So we've kind of just pulled out some of the key points that I think represent some of the more notable guidelines. So in the village centers, and when I say village centers, you'll recall I'm talking about the core areas, the mixed use areas, as well as the transit station area. So some of the key guidelines you'll find are locating buildings close to the sidewalk and activating the street edge. And the guidelines are very explicit about the role of locating buildings close to the sidewalk to help promote pedestrian activity and create a more enclosed, comfortable built form. The guidelines speak a lot to respecting the overall village scale. And the intent is to see a minimum of 2 stories being kind of the typical established built form character in each of the villages. And where buildings are intended to be taller, as may be permitted by the official plan, the guidelines do promote the use of upper story step backs. So beyond the 2nd story, the upper stories need to be stepped back from the front building facade. And that just helps to soften the impact on the streetscape from a visual point of view. Emphasizing views and vistas to key features that needs to be reviewed as part of development review. And maintaining transition is very important too. And the guidelines speak to a number of different tools for addressing that, including setbacks from the lot lines, as well as angular planes. And an angular plane is sort of this urban design concept where you set out this imaginary 3-dimensional plane that extends over the property, and height cannot exceed that plane. And it's usually at a 45-degree angle extended out from the rear lot line. So it's a way of ensuring that taller buildings will have transition to low-rise areas that might be adjacent to them. Next slide. So a few other key principles and guidelines that we pulled out from the village centers. So promoting development that addresses the streetscape. Again, bringing buildings close to the streetscape and promoting a high quality of architectural treatment in the front facade and the exterior side yard. Parking is to be directed to the rear yard in particular, and only in limited cases would it be permitted in the side yards. And again, this is about promoting more of an enclosed built form. Achieving high compatibility between new development and existing low-rise uses. I've kind of spoken to that already, but there certainly are village core areas and mixed-use areas that do back onto and interface directly with low-rise residential areas. So there's a need to have some guidelines that speak to how you can ensure compatibility and transition from an impact and a development, development impact and an aesthetic point of view as well. Development is to be shaped to be pedestrian oriented and to provide some buffering from busy regional roads. So you'll find the guidelines will speak to allowing for some degree of setback, like bringing buildings close to the street, but having a comfortable pedestrian boulevard that can allow the township to add streetscaping improvements, so to soften sort of the impact of the regional roads. And promoting architectural excellence and sustainable design. So lots of guidelines speak to promoting green roofs, promoting other elements, pervious surfaces, sustainable native landscaping, and things that just bring about more of a sustainable approach to design. Next slide. Maintaining a consistent roof line across the streetscape is an important design principle as well. In sort of, I like to use the word visual harmony, right? It's not just about the location of the buildings and the height of the buildings, but there are horizontal architectural elements that you can kind of coordinate between sites to create some visual harmony in the streetscape and promote just an overall positive aesthetic. The guidelines also speak to architectural elements. They speak to using high quality and traditional building materials, minimizing the use of stucco and more inexpensive materials. They speak to glazing, which means using windows to add kind of life and activation to the streetscape, and using other architectural elements to promote an attractive streetscape. You'll find some guidelines for accessibility, and as well, like I've said earlier, for green technology and sustainability. You'll also find too, the guidelines are quite detailed in terms of different building typologies. And that's very important because the township's very likely to get applications for all kinds of different development, not just mixed use buildings, but maybe some low-rise apartment buildings. And if you're familiar with townhouses, I mean, there's 8 different kinds of townhouse formats that I think all require some unique guidance because they all have different design challenges. So the guidelines are very detailed about giving some guidance for different typologies. Next slide. So that's a bit of a summary of some of the key guidelines for the village centers. For the established neighborhoods, just again, a few key points. A very key point speaks to height and massing and compatibility and transition. I think that's very fundamental in the established neighborhoods where, you know, there have been instances of very, very large buildings and homes being built next to much smaller homes. And that's not just an issue of compatibility and you know, shadow impact and privacy impact. It's also a bit of an aesthetic impact. And there are ways you can design homes more sensitively so that you have some transition in roof lines, and you identify those visual elements between properties to help create some harmony in that regard. And it creates a much more aesthetic compatibility, so to speak. The guidelines speak to setbacks and promoting spaciousness, aligning homes with neighboring dwellings, right? If all the homes on a street are set back very consistently, then the new homes should similarly respect that setback. You know, if all homes have very large side yard setbacks, the new homes should also respect that existing condition. And that'll allow for improved built form, natural light, and also facilitating landscaping opportunities. The guidelines speak to entrances as being a focal feature for buildings. So, you know, entrances should be highlighted architecturally and also complement the composition of the facade, just as sort of that kind of link between the public realm and the private realm. Next slide. Again, an emphasis, just like in the village centers, on using high quality materials that are functional, complementary, and energy efficient. You know, minimizing the use of economical materials and promoting a more high quality streetscape. Another key point is you'll find some guidelines speaking to garages and driveways. And you know, the intent is to reduce the visual dominance of garages and driveways, especially if that's not an element of the existing character of the neighborhood. You certainly want people to have the space to accommodate their vehicles, but to do so in a way that's sensitive to the overall context, and also allowing opportunity for landscaping to occur. You know, we don't want to see driveways and garages completely dominate the site and reduce the opportunity for landscaping. Because I think a lot of the neighborhoods are characterized by mature vegetation and opportunities for planting, for maintaining mature trees, and those kinds of things should absolutely be identified and preserved. Next slide. A few other points on established neighborhoods. So providing permeable surfaces, minimizing hardscape is an important point of the guidelines, and something that the zoning bylaw as well as the official plan speaks to. There's some guidelines on accessory structures to, again, contribute to that visual transition and minimize very large accessory structures that are just out of place and impactful to the neighbors. Additions, there's some guidelines on additions to match existing roof lines and create that visual cohesiveness, and a recommendation to use non-invasive species for tree plantings or street plantings, and there are some guidelines for road sections and style to retain the qualities that you see in the neighborhood as they are now. Okay, next slide, please. So that's a bit of a summary of some of the key principles and guidelines in the established neighborhoods. In the employment areas, just a few points here. So there's absolutely an emphasis on achieving a high standard of building design. You know, again, promoting high quality materials, you know, having facades that are kind of interesting. You see a lot of employment areas in other cities, they'll be kind of bland, and they'll be kind of these blank faces. But in King Township, there's absolutely an emphasis on promoting more of an appropriate village scale, and you can do so at least in part through architectural treatment. To the extent possible, activating the street edge, creating some opportunity to promote walkability in the employment areas by locating buildings in the right place, by by providing bicycle parking and pedestrian access to help support that objective. Next slide. Again, emphasizing architectural excellence, particularly important in the employment areas, using high quality materials. Height should be a maximum of 2 stories. I think actually maybe a minimum of 2 stories. But you know, again, trying to get away from blank, boring facades and utilizing buildings that are much more interesting and also respectful of the scale and the character of the villages. So like I said, a lot of the employment areas are actually at the gateways of the different villages. And enhancing building entrances through architectural treatment, but also through different amenities and connectivity to the streetscape. Okay, so that's a bit of a summary of all of the guidelines, and then just a few words on some of the implementation tools, and then we can move on to the Q&A and comment period. So implementation of the guidelines, I think, is really key, right? You might be wondering, well, so what? There's this urban design guidelines document. You know, what happens next? Does it just, you know, sit on a shelf and not do anything? But absolutely not. It's very much an active document that the township's going to be using moving forward, principally through development review. So the township requires what we call a site plan approval process for many different kinds of development, and the design guidelines get applied through the site plan review process in particular. But there's other processes as well where the design guidelines can come into play. Like, for example, the township has a community improvement plan which incentivizes certain desirable forms of improvements to private property, and the design guidelines can be applied through that process as well. In some cases, the township may require an urban design report or a brief, especially for more substantial development. So they'll actually ask developers to explain and write how the guidelines are being addressed in development. And in some cases, the township could engage a third-party peer review. So another consultant to give some guidance on applications and help the township with assessing compliance with the guidelines. Okay, so I think that wraps up the presentation, Matt. I will hand it back to you for the Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bobby. And hope folks were found that informative and were able to get sort of a preview or overview of what the urban design guidelines contain, and maybe some things to look out for if you haven't had a chance to take a look at them just yet. So just a refresher on some of the ways that we can participate in the Q&A this evening. You can raise your hand using the raise hand feature in the control bar, or Alt-Y on Mac or on Windows and Option-Y on Mac. I don't believe anyone's joining us over the phone, but if you are, you can press *9 and then *6 to unmute and mute. And certainly welcome you to use the chat box to ask your question or leave a comment. And again, just a refresher that we will be recording our responses and the whole session. So if there is something you miss, you'll be able to view that at a later date. And then certainly when you're called upon, feel free to unmute yourself. So as the questions come in, I'll maybe direct them to the best staff or WSP person to kick things off, but certainly welcome the rest of the project team to chime in if someone wants to round out an answer. So I do see a hand up from John, and John, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks very much. I'd just like to, I'm with the Ontario Masonry Council. We follow municipal official plans, urban design guidelines, and secondary plans around the province. We've been to 130 municipalities, more than that, multiple times, and just like to congratulate the consultant team and the township on what's really we think is a really terrific document that really captures what a lot of communities all over Ontario want, which is to maintain that small town feel and to maintain that character. And this is we certainly in all the things we've seen, this is really a great document. I do have one quick question though. The document is fantastic as it relates to village centers and also to established neighborhoods. How does it apply to, or does it apply to greenfields and larger larger developments?
Great question. Kristen, do you want to start with that, or John? Or John T?
Yeah, no, I'm fine. I don't know if Kristen wanted to mention something first, but we good?
You go ahead. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sean.
Typically, John, the greenfield areas, King Township has requirements for architectural design guidelines for any of those greenfield developments. How these guidelines would be used, they provide sort of that baseline that any of those developments would have to adhere to, and then they would obviously have additional guidelines with respect to any special features within that greenfield subdivision. But that's, again, as Bobby mentioned at the beginning, this was more related specifically to the employment areas, consolidating the village guidelines and making sure that we had guidelines for established neighborhoods, because there are already those tools in place that the township has for new greenfield.
Right. Okay, thanks very much. Congratulations again.
Thank you much. Thank you very much to both Johns. Really appreciate it. Okay, any other questions from folks? James, why don't you go ahead?
There, can you hear me okay, Matt?
Loud and clear.
Beautiful. There's so much to think about here, and I'm not going to try to ask all the questions or say everything now, but I wanted to just start by saying thanks for this, just the open houses and the thorough process you're going through. I'm excited about this. I know personally, I guess I'm kind of one of those that's fascinated with urban planning as well as architecture, and so this is a beautiful marriage of the two. And so I have a lot of interest in that. I'm glad to see that we're expanding the guidelines to include the established neighborhoods. I think just with the dramatic changes happening in King, that's a really positive direction. Now, what else I was going to say at this point? As I said, I'm not going to try to say it all right now. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it there right now. Just say I'm really encouraged with the process and the goals of what this project is all about. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, James, and you certainly to you and to everyone on the call. You know, this is a lot of information to digest in a somewhat short period of time, and so on the last slide, we'll flash up some email addresses and contact information, and certainly would welcome you to submit any written comments or thoughts as a follow-up to the session, should those come to mind, or should have more of an opportunity to weigh in. I'll go to the chat box really quickly to take a couple questions. And so there's a question here about how these guidelines, or there's an understanding of how these guidelines are applied, but a question of maybe how some of these guidelines can be applied to the hamlets and the countryside, especially as these areas become connected through pedestrianization and trails. And I don't know if Kristen, you maybe want to take a first cut at that one. As we just, council just adopted the new zoning bylaw for the countryside.
Certainly, and thanks, Matt, and thank you for the question. So the guidelines are intended to apply to the villages in the township, so King City, Nobleton, and Schomberg. And in terms of being applied to the hamlets and countryside, that's not the intent of this document, although we can always certainly take inspiration from the guidelines when reviewing any applications in hamlets and in the countryside. But those areas really have their own unique characters and characteristics that these guidelines aren't intended to apply to. In terms of connecting or speaking about the connectivity between the hamlets and the villages, we certainly have the township's active transportation plan and the transportation network that will help assist connecting those areas. And but this document really isn't intended to apply to the hamlets and the countryside. If that answers the question. I'm not sure if anyone else on the team had anything to add.
Doesn't look like it. Thanks so much, Kristen. And so there's a two-part question here, and I'll start it with Kristen, but then perhaps John may want to weigh in. And so I believe from Councillor Schaefer, just wondering if sort of the third-party review is what the township currently considers architecture review, and then maybe for the team to weigh in on is it envisioned that a one-lot development in the core area would require a peer review, and who might pay for that process. So I don't know if Kristen, you want to start with sort of that first piece, and if someone from WSP wants to round it out.
Certainly. And so, yes, in terms of our process now, if an application came in the village core and was proposing new development, we would send that application to our peer review consultant, who would review it from an architectural perspective and provide comments and input. And right now, and the way that our process is set up is that the applicant would be responsible for covering the costs of that peer review. So that would be billed back to the consultant as part of their development application. And when an application is submitted to the township, there's a part in the form where the applicant needs to acknowledge that any costs incurred as part of the processing of the application would be billed back to the applicant. So that's how it's set up currently under the township's urban design guidelines and our process right now. And we're certainly open to input into how to implement the design guidelines moving forward in the township.
Thanks, Kristen. John or Bob, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I can add to that. I think also the intention too is that the new set of guidelines and some of the more prescriptive aspects of it will allow the township to be able to do the review internally. But the idea is to, part of the implementation piece was sometimes there are more complex things that are submitted. They may be a little bit different and they require a third party in order to be pulled in, and that's where that comes into place. The other thing is that usually with the third party peer reviews, and Kristen, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but usually before any work gets started, there's usually some quote provided to the applicant so that they are aware of that, of the cost of the undertaking itself too. So it is pretty transparent, I think, in that way.
Certainly, John, and anytime before the township incurs any costs associated with that, we definitely have open lines of communication with the applicant.
Thanks so much, Kristen and John. So we'll go to those who have the hands raised. Mary, why don't you go ahead?
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Great. So thank you very much for taking my question, and thank you very much for the great work you're doing on this. These set of guidelines are fantastic. I have a question with regard to implementation. You talked about site plan control, and not every change in a lot comes under site plan control. Some just comes under building applications. And also, what will you do if somebody says from an architectural point of view, no, I don't want to comply with that architectural guideline? Like how would you enforce it? I understand that you would have it reviewed, but how would you enforce it?
Thank you for the question. Kristen, do you maybe want to
Certainly,
kick
I
off
can
with that
kick
one?
that off. So the township recently revised the site plan control bylaw. And so the site plan control bylaw will apply more extensively within the township, and it captures starting next year, single detached dwellings, so replacement homes, large scale additions, large scale accessory structures would all be subject to site plan approval in established neighborhoods. And through that process, we work really collaboratively with homeowners to address the guidelines and ensuring that the development, as as close as possible can come into conformity with the guidelines. There's always a little bit of give and take, and there's also, you know, we're not expecting every home, especially in the established neighborhood, to look the same or to subscribe to very prescriptive design elements. There's certainly room for creativity in the design guidelines, but it's making sure certain principles are met with that development, ensuring compatibility or transition into other developments. If we're taking the established neighborhoods as an example, I'm not sure, John, if you had anything to add there.
Yeah, I think that then up until now, I think it's important to keep in mind, that's one of the reasons why the guidelines have been created, because up until now, there was really no guidance that whether it's a homeowner or a builder that could refer to and see what are sort of the criteria, what are some of the encouragements that are made in the guidelines in terms of how do you fit in terms of massing, in terms of the placement of the housing and so on. And so now what these guidelines do is they do provide a framework around those things that allows both, as soon as somebody's looking at it, they can actually refer to this document along with their zoning and all the other stuff that they take care of, and to be able to, in a conversation with the township, to be able to explain how they've either arrived at the plan, how they actually comply with some of those guidelines, because in the end, it's to their benefit too. It speeds up the process. Whereas, you know, when you're reviewing something and it's very different, you're still going to have to be reviewing it to make sure that it's compatible, that it makes sense in terms of what it is. And I think it is important. I think Kristen mentioned it already. We're not looking for it to be identical. We're looking for new development to fit and to fit in an appropriate way. Doesn't mean it's going to be exactly the same as what's next door to it, but what it does mean is it'll take into consideration its context, and through the guidelines and through some directions, if you take some of these elements and you implement them into the design, you'll hopefully be able to come closer to doing that, to ensuring that you've got that fit.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thanks for those responses. I'll go maybe next to Charles with your hand up.
Hi there. Is the audio good?
Loud and clear.
Okay, so thanks so much. And I appreciate you, once again, as people have said, taking the question. And congratulations to you guys. This look is looking really good. So congratulations to the consultants and to the staff and counselors. Very impressed so far. So I have a couple of comments regarding one of the sections in the draft document that I read earlier today. So in section 3.10, which is the recent developments / application proposals, on the Schomburg stuff, there was one in section 3.1.4. There's the new 3-story building on 215 Main. One of the recommendations there was that in similar buildings, the residential entrances that should be visible from the street. But I think in the case of this building, they've done a really good job. They've made the correct decision in highlighting the retail space on the street front rather than the residential. They've moved the residential entrances to the side. It highlights the retail nature of the ground floor. It doesn't confuse the purpose of the building at the pedestrian level. And in fact, it's actually consistent with traditional building form along Main Street, where other mixed use buildings, and by these I mean retail / commercial on the street level with residential above, they all had residential entrances on the side. So I just took a couple of examples. 324 Main, Schomburg Quality Meats, residential are steps up on the south wall. 289 Main, Leonardo's, ditto. 239 Main, Horizon Real Estate, the side entrance, and it's stepped back from the street line. So it's subservient to the retail. Exactly the same thing with 245 Cake Realty. So I think what they've done, my point here is I think what they've done is right. And I think the recommendation is not correct in this particular case. So I'd like you guys to take a look at that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the important thing to keep in mind is it's should. And I think the objective of that is to make sure that it's clearly defined. So clearly defined doesn't mean it has to be out onto the street. maybe we can adjust we can take a look at that again and adjust the wording to have that flexibility. But typically what we'll say, a lot of times you will see that, for instance, in the village core, we might say that on a corner, for instance, you might have the entrance for the residential portion of an upper story on one side, and you leave the street frontage to retail. And that's pretty much a similar idea. But I think the important objective of the guideline is always to ensure that it's quite clear visually, that there's visual cues about where the residential entrance is and where the retail entrance is. And so that's why it's important to hear from everybody today, because if that's not clear, then we have to go back and be a little bit more.
Yeah. Okay. I understand your point. I mean, of landmarking, this is retail and this is residential. I'm just saying consistently in Schaumburg, it's been done the way it was done in that new building. So I think it fit.
Yeah.
Also, I was hoping to see some mention of infill projects. You mentioned two places and neither of them was infill. I would have liked to have seen the discussion paper address, for example, 66 Main, which is the heritage building across from the library. Many people in town will know it as Mark Coburn's house. That building is supposed to be maintained on whatever development takes place behind it. And I don't know what's happening there. I would have liked to have seen something about that. 326 Main, the proposed 6-story development adjacent to the Dufferin Marsh, which is in a location that's currently zoned for a 3-story building. Dufferin Marsh is identified as being part of the village natural heritage system, and I would like to have seen how that infill might be reflected in this type of document, in the draft document. And for like a true infill, as in a housing replacement entrance, there is a new residential property at 45 Church Street. I would like to see some discussion about how that may have been addressed utilizing this document. On another issue, I don't expect you to answer any of those, but it was just things for you to please take note of in the next draft. On another issue, I've got like concerns about the ability of the established neighborhood focus in this document, and as a matter of fact, in all of our documents, to enable us in King to allow young people to move here or to remain here if they grew up here. There's an affordability problem. Now, this is not really part of this discussion. It's part of something else. But if we focus less on use and more on form in terms of the regulation, I'm talking about form-based codes, there might be some kind of a chance for King to maintain growth and livability in the future. There was a section, I've forgotten the number, I wrote it down and I've lost my piece of paper. It talked about the highway corridor, Highway 11. I presume that's up by Bradford. Is that correct, the part that we're talking about? That, because I think there's 2 highway corridors, obviously through King, but none of them are specifically in either of the towns. There's Highway 400 and Highway 11 does cross the upper tip up in Avia's ward at the very north. And I guess that's what you're talking about there. I just wasn't sure. And my final comment would have been about, other people have mentioned this as well, as guidelines versus requirements. How will this be implemented? It's all well and good to say these are guidelines, but unless the guidelines are pointed to and they have some kind of regulatory force, they're just not all that important. So I just wanted, and I think that's sort of been answered, but it was a concern that I had as well. And I wanted to make sure that I brought it out in my rant here. So thanks for listening to me.
Thanks so much, Charles. Certainly a lot of great sort of comments, questions, or just sort of observations. And I think I've seen some people taking some notes, and myself included. So I think some things to think about as we finalize. I don't know if Kristen or Loma, did you want to respond to anything specifically, or okay to
maybe, sorry, just on the implementation piece, I just wanted to also reiterate that the township's official plan, which is it's been approved, it's in force and effect for the villages. And so it really does speak a lot to design elements. And there's a lot that's these design guidelines build on from those policies in the official plan. Those policies are in effect. And, if those policies are not being met, then an official plan amendment would be required. So that's a regulatory document that gives teeth to these guidelines in certain respects.
Thanks, Kristen. Helpful context.
Matt, can I just add a quick point with respect to
Please.
implementation? I'm thinking too, one of the outcomes of this process is the possibility that the new guidelines could inform future updates to township documents. Like, for example, if we find that there are some excellent guidelines that are worth codifying in the zoning bylaw, that could inform a future update to the zoning. So there could be some means of kind of elevating the status of some of these guidelines just as an outcome of this process.
Great additional context, Bobby. Thank you. Okay, I'm just taking a look back at the chat box and perhaps like a question for Kristen, because it's not off the top of my head, or is how can we, integrate green building standards and green development into urban design? And certainly I know that sustainability and green elements are woven in through the guidelines, but is there anything more you're able to comment on?
Yeah, and I might throw it over to Aloma for this one because she's our expert on green development standards in King Township. So Aloma, I'm not sure if you want to add anything there.
Sure, definitely. So our site plan control bylaw, which would implement the architectural requirements in the established neighborhoods as well, would also speaks to the green building standards, which we have just released a draft of for single family residences throughout the township. So it would apply within the established neighborhoods as well as in the more rural context of the green belt and the Oak Ridges Moraine and the hamlets. So the draft of that is available online, and a number of the metrics do tie in with the built form for single detached dwellings, the reuse of materials, as well as some other architectural elements of new single detached dwellings. In terms of like the village centers and the employment areas, we do have the green development standards that came into effect in 2021, which does have a number of metrics that also speak to like alternative energy as well as material reuse. That does have some impact on the architectural elements. So there is a bit of a tie-in between the documents, and then they're reviewed comprehensively together through the site plan development applications so that there can be a balance between both.
Great. Thanks so much, Aloma. Okay, looking at the chat, there's a little bit of a conversation going on, which is great, just about how the guidelines are structured. And so the question is, will the village center guidelines be universal throughout the township? In other words, will the guidelines be the same for Schaumburg, King City, and Nobleton, or will different village characters be taken into consideration? If so, will that have been done on a case-by-case basis? And will this case-by-case basis add to the cost for developers, builders, and property owners? So I think there's a couple layers of questions in there, and I might start with Bobby just to start with sort of the overall structure of the guidelines.
Sure, I'm happy to. So I guess I'll make a couple of points. That's a great question. I'll just make a couple of points in response to that. So the first point is that we tried to write the guidelines in a way that they're flexible across different contexts. So you'll see like the language is intended to be applied in a manner that helps to ensure that as a development application comes forward, it's thinking about the unique context of the adjacent surrounding area. So they should be flexible enough to be utilized across different contexts. However, I'll also add though that if you have a look at the guidelines, there were some specific circumstances where we felt it was necessary to speak to the villages specifically. So you'll see that there are some specific village guidelines, like guidelines that are only applicable in King City versus Nobleton versus Schaumburg. So we've tried to address that for sure, but I mean, certainly I think I've heard some points already today that indicate maybe there's some need for some additional elaboration on the village specific considerations.
Thanks so much, Bobby. I don't know, John, do you want to weigh in on anything there?
Yeah, I think it's also important to keep in mind that in the existing or soon to be previous guidelines, there was a lot of repetition in those guidelines. And what we were trying to do is find out where the commonalities were and create guidelines that go across the villages, and then try and focus in on those differences, as Bobby mentioned just now. And a big chunk of it, a lot of times, has to do with the public realm, sort of encouragements and guidelines in terms of ensuring that we've got, in King City, for instance, how do we ensure that we get proper, larger boulevards that can accommodate sort of that pedestrian circulation? That's an overall objective of the guidelines. In Schaumburg, we talk about how the Main Street project will be implemented, and then that's sort of the impetus of that. So that's where they really differ. And then, as we could, I mean, a lot of the guidelines, wherever we could be specific in terms of features that were present in the villages, we try and reinforce those. So there was some distinction that way, for sure, in terms of public realm and in terms of maybe some of the built form guidelines for the villages.
Yeah, thanks so much, John. And I think I've gone through the chat box now, which is great to cover those off. And I'll go back to the hands up. And I see, Angelo, you have your hand up. Why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for your presentation. I just have maybe, not sure how many questions there is, but mostly probably comments. I'd like to start off by saying, you mentioned sustainability 3 times in your presentation. I guess it's obviously a very important part of this presentation, which it's good to know that the township does have a sustainability committee. I'm not saying that just because I'm on it, but because it is something that I think is worthwhile. And since mentioning that, what you just heard from Charles, who's from Schaumburg, and you can see his detail and what he knows about downtown Schaumburg is important. I'm just wondering how important it would be to have a committee or a small group of people, for instance, from each village, maybe even through sustainability, who can give some kind of guidance and guidelines to any kind of application that comes in to each village to help maybe the planning part and so forth of this whole guideline. Because it's great to have the guideline. It's really probably even better to have the input from the people on the ground, so to speak. And at the same time, I think it would be very helpful hearing from the community of this group, that maybe anybody who wants to do or is doing development or any kind of changes in the community, to probably minimize their costs and their time if they had some really good guidelines and some input from the local people and local residents. I think that would be a huge advantage to expedite the process, because sometimes the process takes that's the hard part. It takes a long time and it costs a lot of money for either way, the township or the person building or developing. I just want to bring that out. Also, I just wonder, on some of the established residential areas where a lot of these homes, especially I think, well, maybe all over, are knocking down smaller homes and making larger homes. How's the township? What's the word I'm thinking of? How do they not so much control that, but how do you make it work for both the person who's living in a house there for 40 years and someone who just bought the house and now is tearing it down, is going to build something probably 3 times the size? How do you control that with, for instance, the whole subdivision as a whole? Do you control it as a whole, and you have an overall plan for the subdivision, knowing that it's growing and evolving? What's your plan on that? Just a couple of insights that I want to present to you, and I guess the one question I have. But thank you for your presentation, and it'd be nice to have a one-stop shop, I guess, to answer all the questions that people have in terms of doing their development or their project. It'd be nice to be able to go one place at the township who can kind of direct people to the right places. Okay, thank you very much. Long-winded question.
No, thanks so much, Angelo. And I don't know if Kristen or Aloma want to maybe kick it off, and if someone from WC wants to round it out.
Sure. Thanks, Angelo. And certainly something for the project team to ponder on the idea of a committee or some sort of local group for input on review of development applications. So we'll take that back and consider that a little bit further. We do have some regulatory timelines that we do have to process applications in, and I think the province made it quite clear that we need to stick to those timeframes with Bill 109, but we'll definitely still take that into consideration moving forward with the document. And then in terms of the established neighborhoods, we've recently updated the site plan control bylaw, as we mentioned, and that will subject each property to site plan approval where they're trying to replace their home or do a large scale addition. And so these guidelines would apply across the townships, villages, and the established neighborhoods. And so we would review each individual site plan application for each individual home against the guidelines.
Thanks, Kristen. And thanks, Angela, for the questions and comments. Katie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So my question actually jumps back into what Angela was mentioning. And I was going to say, I agree with him that we should have local advisory bodies for each of the wards, the village cores. As a young planner myself, as a young person who's lived in Schomberg for over 2 decades, you know, I want to see more young people at planning council meetings, and I want developers to be able to seek us out. And I was going to ask if there has been any interest or ideas related to a set of youth-oriented urban design guidelines. I've been speaking with a lot of young people who don't know how to get involved or are somewhat interested in some of the changes that they're seeing. However, by the time that the changes get made, they have no chance to actually add in their input, or they find that these spaces are too inaccessible. They don't see themselves as part of this process. So I'm wondering if there's any way that we can use these guidelines to actually support youth engagement in the township and get young people speaking to developers, so that when developers come in, you know, they can come directly to us and they can come directly to the other residents who have been speaking out about certain issues that are needed, or rather solutions that are needed to address some of the issues that we're seeing. And there is a dedicated group of people who are able to be reached out to. And so, yeah, that's essentially my comment. And I would love to hear more if folks are already talking about these things. Thank you.
A really cool idea. I don't know if someone from Bobby, do you have anything to start with, or?
I can certainly kick that off. I think it's a great idea, you know, and I certainly think, you know, Kristen's response about taking that away, I think is a good action, because of course, you know, adding new review committees and steps into the development review process certainly creates some constraints and challenges. There has to be some kind of certainly a middle ground. What I can share from some other municipalities, I might be overstepping a little bit, but part of something that the township could consider is in some other places, there's what's called an urban design review panel. And it's a group of experts, but also community members that will kind of meet on a monthly basis, and they'll look at development applications. They might have like an agenda of all of the different development applications that are active for the month, and they'll offer some commentary drawing from their own perspective and their own expertise. So that's certainly something the township could consider. But like Kristen said, I think that's something to be taken away for further pondering, but great idea.
Aloma or Kristen, anything to round it out, or John even?
Yeah, I think what's important to keep in mind is when we talk about having served on several design review panels is that they're really used for specific projects. It's not for everything and anything. And even when there is a design review panel, if it's made up of local citizens, typically it would be implementing the guidelines that are in place. It's not an opportunity to say whether does it comply with the guidelines is what the idea would be in terms of putting forward comments, because we always have to be very careful that we're not getting away from what the purpose is of what the guidelines are meant to do, which is to provide sort of that guidance and the criteria to ensure that we get good urban design, that we get good compatible in terms of fit into the community, and that we're not getting through a process. There already is a public process for a lot of these things where people can come out. We don't turn it into something where it's a second and a third public process. So just keep that in mind. I think if with respect to design review panels, they're usually pretty specific in terms of what they do. So what I mean by that is there may be areas and this is like, I'm thinking this out loud now, so I'm not trying to commit the township to anything, but it would be one of these things where if it's understood, for instance, development that would go on the main street, that might be a trigger on the main street in Schaumburg. A trigger might be on King Road or on Keel near the transit area in King. That would be a trigger. You see what I mean? So it wouldn't be, you wouldn't look at every single building, but you would look at key areas and where they're located, and that would be something that triggers it. So just so that everybody understands, that's typically how a lot of the design review panels do work in other municipalities.
Thanks, John. Okay. I'm gonna go to James, who has their hand back up, and James, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Matt. I've collected a few of my thoughts here, and I wanted to just affirm some of the direction specifically in the guidelines at this point, and just raise a couple of areas that just concern about how achievable it might be. First of all, the core area, I'm really glad to see the emphasis on the unique character of each community, and sort of taking a look at the elements of that and trying to create guidelines that will reflect and enhance that. So there's a sense of place. I think that's a great direction. I like the focus on integrating heritage buildings, enhancing them. I've seen, a few examples in King already that have had an element of that. I know there's a couple of applications. Well, I don't know if they're applications, but proposals in King City that are moving that way, and it's really good to see, because that is part of what defines our place, our history, our roots. An area of I realize this is beyond your scope, really, and it sort of ties in with our official plan. It ties in with our zoning bylaws. The massing and scale of buildings, which we just talked about in the guidelines. And I'll use King City because it's what I'm most familiar with. And what I see happening, particularly in the core area and the transit station area, are proposals for most often 6-story multi-unit buildings. And I'm really supportive of definitely alternative types of houses or housing and that kind of thing. However, as I look at those proposals, they're very dense. They're high density, really, is what they become. Even though there may be a cap at 6 stories, the actual property itself and the footprint is huge of these buildings. And I'm not sure if the guidelines can work to soften that a whole bunch more, because what I see happening is just long lines of apartment walls, and it almost becoming like a canyon going down Gill Street, for example, in the transit station area. So just to kind of raise that as a concern with what I see coming forward in terms of applications. another area, which is I realize this is something that has to do with zoning bylaws and, well, the official plan. And in my thinking over the last year, I've really become more familiar with the concept of missing middle housing. And if the guidelines can help to encourage that more and more, I think it would be great. And when I say missing middle, that's something that's sort of between a massive multi-unit building and are single detached. And I'd love to see something that encourages those opportunities, because I think there's a lot of people looking for something that probably would fit into that. And I'll leave this with planning staff when there's reviews, but I'd love to see a review that could look at established neighborhoods and consider the possibility of allowing duplexes, possibly triplexes, where they're well designed. And that's where the design guidelines would come in very closely, so that there isn't a dramatic change to character of those areas. The other point I guess I was going to raise is the area of mature trees. And I noticed that that's mentioned, and it's great to see, because that's part of what defines character in our communities and in our neighborhoods. And as I'm sure you're familiar, in a lot of the villages right now with the replacement homes, often what's happening is that the lots are being clear cut before there's real consideration of a kind of look at, are there opportunities to preserve trees? And that probably comes down to something that's beyond your scope, but some sort of regulations or bylaws that would ensure that those trees are considered before a new building goes ahead. Recognizing that often trees do have to come down for certain reasons, but just with the goal of preserving more of our healthy large trees. And I think, okay, well, and one other point I guess I was going to raise, and this is probably applies especially to Nobleton and to King City. I really like the goals of the pedestrian-friendly, pedestrian-oriented designs and buildings, bringing the buildings to the street front, that kind of thing. The regional roads with the traffic in both communities are a huge concern, and the streets aren't really very pedestrian friendly at all. In fact, there's a sense of feeling quite insecure and unsafe on those roads. There's often, especially on the weekdays, large 18-wheel trucks, dump trucks that come through. A high percentage of the traffic is like that. And so I'm just thinking that to achieve the goals of the plan, that needs to be addressed, and it's well beyond your scope, and I understand that, but I kind of leave that there. There's a number of things that need to work together to achieve just the very positive vision that I think the guidelines set out. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, James. Covered a lot of great ground there, and a few different pieces, and I think there's a couple different people who might want to speak to some specific ones. I don't know if Kristen, you wanted to start with anything out the gate, or?
Yeah, thank you so much, Bruce, for all the wonderful comments and suggestions there. We'll definitely take those into consideration moving forward. In terms of maybe just a couple of things that are stuck out to me with the mature trees, and certainly through the site plan review process, we can take a look at those mature trees. But as we know, there is not a tree cutting bylaw that would apply in the established neighborhoods in King Township. So it's certainly something that we would be encouraging through the site plan review process would be maintaining those large mature trees. There would also be the opportunity to look at landscaping. So, if in the event that mature trees need to be removed as part of the development, there would certainly be the opportunity for us to comment about how moving forward the area should be landscaped in order to help soften the new development and ensure that spaciousness and green space is maintained. And then in terms of the pedestrian realm on the regional roads. I think the project team is pretty familiar with the downtowns. We visited, obviously the staff visits quite regularly, but our project team and at WSP also visited the cores of each of the communities and got to experience the pedestrian realm firsthand. So we certainly understand those challenges, and I think that there's some good guidelines in the document to help guide the township in the pedestrian realm moving forward. But there's also been a lot of improvements over the last few years that the township and the region have collaborated on to help make those spaces a bit more visually pleasing. But there's certainly always room for improvement, and anything we can do to slow down traffic on those roads would be welcomed. I'm not sure, John, if you had anything, or Bobby, sorry.
I can certainly jump in, and maybe John can add on after if I've missed something. Yeah, thanks, Bruce, for your comments. Really appreciate it. A few things, I guess, stood out to me as well that I can help to respond to. Your first comment was speaking to massing and sort of the intensity of development, especially in King City. And we certainly tried to write the guidelines to kind of address that issue, and I think it is to some extent addressed insofar as, you know, the guidelines do speak to trying to have sensitivity to the built form of adjacent areas and creating some transition. So hopefully with the guidelines in place, you'll start to see that a little bit more sensitively integrated in the future. I'd also say too, like, the township has some other tools to deal with that, and I can't recall off the top of my head, but I believe the zoning bylaw has some requirements for what's called floor space index, FSI, which is a means of addressing sort of the intensity of development on a site. So I think over time, I think you'll see that issue improved. Another comment you raised was about established neighborhoods and, you know, whether there's some opportunity to expand, opportunity for intensification and so on. I think there's a bit of a limitation in the official plan, because the official plan is quite clear that lot creation is going to be limited, at least in the horizon of the current official plan. But I will say, though, that the province has legislated that municipalities must provide permissions for what's called additional residential units, so like in the form of secondary suites and that sort of thing. So I do think that there is some opportunity for affordable housing provision through that policy framework. So, yeah.
Just say thank you very much, Kristen and Bobby.
Really appreciate it. Okay, looking at the oh, John, did you
just
make
wanted to add
yeah,
in. Yeah, no, I just wanted to add in, Bruce, that a lot of that stuff. Yeah, thank you. There were a lot to unpack in what you said, but it's a lot of the some of the concerns with respect to streetscapes and the pedestrian elements. If you get a chance to take a look at some of the more village-specific guidelines, you'll see that we talk a lot about certain edges and how we can improve that pedestrian experience based on what's there now. So you'll see some direction with that. It's always tough to deal with regional roads, though, in terms of how we deal with it. Secondly, you talked a lot about missing middle, and in many ways, a 6-story building is part of that number, including triplexes and quadplexes and so on. But that is supposed to be part of that notion when we're talking about missing middle. And I think what's important to keep in mind is we're not dealing with canyons. There's enough guidance in terms of the guidelines speaking to breaking up very repetitive or long facades, ensuring that we step buildings back at a pedestrian scale, so that what you're experiencing is a few stories. You're not experiencing the full 6 stories as you're coming along the street edge. So there are a whole bunch of elements. The reality is all this stuff has to come together at the same time to really realize it. But in the near term, it might be a 6-story building, but with all sort of that sculpting and massing transition that makes it fit. And then hopefully as we move into the future and you get that type of development, it actually does push the idea of resulting in better and wider boulevards, because now there's a justification to it. You know, you gave the example of King and Keel Street. I can imagine coming down Keel Street from King Road, that the ability to actually have a good edge along that street with a good pedestrian boulevard will change the way that you would experience that, and it wouldn't be a canyon, so to speak. But it's all those elements have to come together. But that's sort of the intention and the objective of the guidelines.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Thanks, John. Okay, I'll go to the next question in order that it came. Katie in the chat, just sort of speaking, the question sort of regarding, you know, how the guidelines may or could speak to storefronts that orient towards bike lanes and sidewalks and not just car access through parking. And there's some specific references. A lot of newer plazas have this problem, which is quite unfriendly for pedestrians and active transportation. I don't know if Kristen or Aloma, you want to weigh in on that one first?
I think maybe perhaps John, if you have anything
Okay.
there. I think that the guidelines do address
Yeah.
that. There are guidelines, especially for the village cores, that would
Yeah.
address that.
Yeah, we speak a lot to that, Katie, in the sense of it's a pretty standard approach. You're going to see that in any guidelines that you see now. I think where we differ is we also include the reality of existing buildings, right? And so as they're retrofitted, how can we improve that connection, right? So if you do have, in some instances where you have plazas, and there are actually some good examples, the ones I can give are in Nobleton, where they've tried to create that pedestrian connection out right out to the street, and it leads you into the plaza. But the idea is to not just look at that. Obviously, the encouragements always are that we're bringing the buildings close to the street, that we're addressing the frontage that way. One of the important aspects that we have in these guidelines, it's important to keep in mind, is we talk about having active facades. And what that means is we need to try and avoid as much as we can this idea of, it's not just a case of bringing up windows to the street, but making sure that they're active, that they're not back of house conditions for the buildings. So what I mean by that is either blank walls or walls where they put up some sort of a covering that actually, you know, it's one thing to have shades, it's another thing to just cover it up and have it covered forever. So there's a lot of emphasis on trying to deal with that aspect of how do we activate that boulevard. And you'll see if you go through the guidelines, you'll see we talk a lot about understanding that right now there are some constraints to the boulevards, and and encouragements to new development to look at how do we increase that? How do we make sure that's got a little bit more a comfortable width so that we can get tree planting, a continuous tree planting edge, and create that better pedestrian environment. So I hope that answers your question. But
I think I saw a thumbs up on Katie's icon, so
yeah.
I hope it covered it. Angelo, why don't you go ahead?
Hey, thank you. I just want to occurred to me, we have a Main Street reconstruction coming up in the next few years. I believe it's 2026, if I'm not mistaken, on the budget that I saw. On Main Street, have you taken into consideration the Main Street reconstruction and all the work that we're going to be doing on Main Street, Schaumburg, considering that is really the only one that's owned by the township, so to speak, whereas the Main Street is, other ones are York Regional roads. I'm just wondering, have you taken that into account? And exactly, I saw before that you guys were all smiling about the fact that you had to walk on all the village cores, which is great. I hope you all stayed long enough to have a coffee and watch all the traffic go by. And I invite you all to come at 7:45 in the morning on Wednesday, which is tomorrow, downtown Schaumburg, while all the trucks come in and out and all the garbage trucks go in and out. And how you've incorporated that in this guidelines when it comes to the new road construction. That's my question, if you've taken that into account. Thank you.
Thanks, Angelo. And I know that was certainly a discussion item in our discussion paper. And I don't know if, John, you want to kick it off with some of the things that were thought about in the guidelines?
Well, I think because a lot of work has already been done on Main Street, we've sort of been a little bit acquiescent to that, noting that that's what's going to come into effect, and that's what will really drive a lot of the design. Our encouragements are mostly with built form and the way that they should address that street. With respect to the garbage trucks, I don't think there's some way that the guidelines can deal with that. That's something beyond the guidelines, I think. But in terms of the Main Street itself, though, Angelo, I think that the intention is that we have taken that into consideration. We do talk a little bit about that, but because we don't have the final sort of design, it would be one of those things where we would include it. Now, the way the guidelines are set up is it allows, when that does get completed and those are in place, it would become an appendix within these guidelines. So you would go to that section and there'd be a reference in the document saying to go to that appendix to get the details with on Main Street. Or Schaumburg.
If I may, I just want to make a point. If you could, please, if there's any way you can ever address the hydro wires, that would be a real miracle, just to let you know. Thank you.
Every municipality, it's always the same thing. So I hear you. I hear you.
Thanks so much, Angelo and John. Well, I'm not seeing any other hands up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually reshare my screen and just go over some of the next steps in the process for those who may want to or may need to step away and then certainly understand. So just give me 1 second to queue that up. Bear with me 1 second, folks. Sure we're showing the right thing. Perfect. So just for the benefit of everyone, we have some Kristen and Aloma's contact information on the screen, and we've certainly addressed a great number of comments and questions today, which is fantastic, and would encourage you to follow up with the project team should anything come to mind after this session. Oh, maybe my screen isn't sharing yet. I saw Kristen hold to interject. Hold on 1 second. Now it should be up. Excellent. All right. Take 2 on that. So covered a great number of comments and questions, which is great. And so on the screen are Kristen and Aloma's contact information if you would like to reach out. And don't worry about having to jot this down too quickly. It's all on the speaking page, which has the access to the guidelines, the discussion paper, and we'll have the recording of today's session for you to view at a later date. So do feel free to reach out to the team and visit that page to learn more. So in terms of some next steps in the process, and we kind of alluded to this throughout this presentation, but the work will begin to finalize the guidelines based on the input received tonight, as well as further review by the project team and other stakeholders to make sure we have a sort of a wide variety of perspectives as we work to finalize those, and then they will ultimately be presented to Township Council at a later date and certainly post municipal election. And so the link to the speaking page is up here on the screen at speaking.king.ca, and that's your central repository for all things urban design guidelines, including learning more about the project, the recordings, and other future notifications. So would encourage you to subscribe to that page if you have not yet already. Before we wrap up, I'm just going to double check something. And Kristen or Aloma, did you want to say anything to the group?
Yeah, maybe I'll just start off just to say thank you so much for everyone and for all the great participation this evening. We really do appreciate the comments, the questions. It helps us understand, what we've got right in the document, what needs more work. So keep it coming. Any comments you can provide, we'll definitely take everything into consideration. And any written comments we receive, we will track in a comment response matrix. So we'll be sure to get back to you with responses in a comprehensive manner, just to let you know how we've taken those comments into consideration and what's kind of changed in the document moving forward. So thank you so much for everyone's participation. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Kristen. Thanks to Bobby and John for the presentation and for jumping in on the questions. We look forward to continuing forward with the project and do follow along. So really appreciate everyone taking the time out of their evening and hope you have a great rest of the night. Take care, everyone.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night, everyone. Great questions.